Welcome back to our program on the Vietnam War History and Memory. Thanks for being here, everyone. This afternoon, right now, we're going to hear about Armed with Abundance, Consumerism and Soldiering in the Vietnam War with Professor Meredith Lair from George Mason University. She's an associate professor of history there, where she teaches about the Vietnam War, war in American society, and veterans in American history. She is the author of the Armed with Abundance, Consumerism and Soldiering in the Vietnam War, which came out in 2011. She received a Ph.D. in history from Penn State University in 2004. And after speaking with her the other day on the phone, I learned that she's from an Army family. Her dad was in the Army for quite some time, so we're glad you're here with us. And let's welcome Professor Lair. Thank you.
Thank you all for coming today, for being here in person. I also want to give a shout out to the people who are watching from elsewhere on the webinar. And I also want to say thank you to the museum staff, especially John Moss and Kenneth Felix, for organizing this event and making everything go smoothly, and for inviting me. So I'm so glad to be here. Talking about the Vietnam War is literally my favorite thing to do. So I'm here today to talk to you a book that I wrote a good while ago, but that I hope holds up in terms of its investigation and interpretation of everything that has nothing to do with combat in the Vietnam War. So Armed with Abundance is a good fit for this symposium for a couple of reasons. First, because it examines the experiences of Americans who served on the ground in South Vietnam. Because 60% of military personnel who served in the Vietnam War were in the Army, and because the Army provided logistical support to the other service branches in Vietnam, the book is rooted primarily in U.S. Army sources. Armed with Abundance is also a good fit for this symposium because it examines both the history, that is the lived experience of the Vietnam War, as well as the memory of it. Not the individual memory of the war, but the way that Americans have, in negotiation with one another, constructed a collective memory, a set of stories, ideas, tropes, even myths about the war that are sometimes in conflict with what the historical record tells us. So this is the project of this book, to explore the chasm that exists between the American public's perception of the Vietnam War and what the experience was often like for a great number, perhaps even a majority of its participants. We tend to remember Vietnam this way, as an experience of deprivation, violence, and sacrifice, with combat as the underlying cause. But the physical reality of the world the US military made in South Vietnam is strikingly incongruous with popular representations of the war zone. And I don't mean this photograph, I mean movies and the way people kind of talk about Vietnam in popular culture. Because the vast majority of American military personnel who inhabited this world that the US military made there lived and worked on the shooting war's periphery. So I like to say that this book does not change the plot of the Vietnam War, but it does change the setting, which complicates how we remember it. In terms of talking about American military service in Vietnam, I'd like to start by acknowledging what I call the default narrative of the Vietnam War. In this version of the Vietnam War, American military service focuses on the harsh environmental conditions, the material deprivation, physical exhaustion, extreme violence that the war imposed on its participants. And there are no shortage of images to represent the hardships that American soldiers endured. And some of those images are so well known that they have become synonymous with war photography and even with the memory of the Vietnam War itself. In making this point, I like to use Henry Hewitt's photo of wounded medic PFC Thomas Cole, which is a famous photo in its own right, as it appeared on the covers of Life magazine, the New York Times, and other papers in early 1966. This photograph is absolute in its representation of the Vietnam War as a landscape of horror. A muddy trench provides only an illusion of safety to badly injured men, including the medic charged with caring for them despite his own wounds. As the longer sequence of photographs shows, Hewitt's skilled framing of the scene makes a subtle comment on the immediacy of death through the upturned hand next to the medic's knee. The hand belongs to a third figure draped in a poncho who lays motionless. The hand never moves over the course of several frames taken minutes apart. Even though we can't see the combat going on nearby, the confinement of the trench in which the dead and injured lie next to one another, the seriousness of their wounds, and the fact that these men are still awaiting evacuation, which suggests a tenuous tactical situation, all work together to affirm the urgency of their plight. And yet, despite these horrors, or perhaps because of them, Hewitt's photograph is powerfully reassuring. The medic's insistent and tender devotion to duty, in spite of his own injuries, is emotionally affirming of American soldiers' commitment to one another, enabling everyone who views this image, regardless of their opinions about the Vietnam War, to retrieve something positive from it. It doesn't matter whether these men believed in the cause or wanted to serve. Hewitt didn't report their opinions. He probably didn't even ask. What matters in the photograph is the soldiers' devotion to duty and the suffering they endured on behalf of the nation. Focusing on war suffering to the exclusion of everything else, this is a commemorative strategy that dates back to the American Revolution. Most representations and commemorations of the Vietnam War follow this trend as they excise references to, say, the anti-war movement or national politics in an earnest attempt to focus on the lived experiences of American soldiers, especially those in combat. What matters, what gets commemorated, what gets saved, what gets written about, are usually artifacts that speak to individual sacrifice. And that sacrifice is almost always understood in terms of physical suffering. So the question that I ask in Armed with Abundance is, what happens to a war story when the soldiers in it aren't physically suffering? Or more accurately, in the Vietnam context, when there is physical suffering, but it is unevenly spread? How does the story of the Vietnam War change if we expand the frame of Hewitt's photograph and consider the material abundance awaiting these soldiers when they return to a well-stocked base camp on stand down? Or they were sent to convalesce at a hospital in the rear, or they passed through a big rearward base on their way to and from a forward area, or they rotated into a non-combat specialty that took them away from places and situations like this one for the duration of their tours. And note that while a lot of military personnel temporarily experienced these well-stocked rearward spaces as they transited the war zone, it didn't escape their attention that a lot of American military personnel got to live and work there all the time. I'm not suggesting that we negate our understanding of combat as being terrifically frightening, nor of service in Vietnam as being incredibly challenging. Instead, I'm suggesting that we expand the range of experiences that we associate with military service in the Vietnam War and in later wars, and that we appreciate the rarity of scenes like this one when compared to the totality of experiences Americans had in Vietnam. Just miles away, there existed another world of the Vietnam War altogether, one that we don't often see or hear about, where the mud was tamped into orderly streets, where ball caps replaced bandages, and where swimming pools and consumer goods took precedence over the bullets. In Vietnam, the vast majority of American troops, at least 75% of them, some estimates put it at 90%, did not serve in combat. Instead, they fulfilled myriad supporting roles and lived on rearward bases that were far from the sufferings and deprivations of contested areas. And many of those who participated in combat, especially airmen, returned to comfortable, well-stocked base camps when an operation was over, lending the production of the war's violence a surreal, routinized quality. The US military authorized these built environments in order to raise troop morale, the better to keep up the fight and win the war, or at least to prevent the occupation's total collapse. The US military flooded the war zone with consumer goods to provide succor to soldiers' bodies as they worked and fought, but also to wrap the war's veterans in the trappings of affluence upon returning home. These comfortable material circumstances equipped US forces to generate violence, and despite a conflict that was laden with futility, the war machine was always viciously effective at creating destruction. It was less good, as I'm going to speak to later, it turns out, at creating economic and political stability. American soldiers were quite literally armed with abundance, making the project of the war perhaps easier and certainly more palatable, but also more problematic given the necessity of winning Vietnamese people's hearts and minds. So now I want to turn to another image of the war, one that you won't recognize, one that isn't iconic or even familiar, at least not to the public. I recognize this is a self-selected group and there are a lot of veterans present, but in terms of how the public sees the war, the shopping soldier is not how the public imagines the Vietnam War. So here we have a young soldier shopping for comfort items in his base's PX. The photo of the soldier provides a window into the material conditions of daily life for Americans in Vietnam, while also hinting at less well or remembered challenges of war zone military service. And this soldier is a young man, but he looks tired. His uniform is big on him, suggesting he may have lost weight, as soldiers did on remote bases where they perform manual labor in stifling heat. Soldiers on rearward bases and sedentary jobs tended to gain weight in the Vietnam War. He also looks vaguely stunned, presumably the surprise of a flashbulb going off in his face while he's picking up sundries at the PX. But given the capriciousness of the draft, a lot of American soldiers were stunned to find themselves in the military, let alone in Vietnam, where they faced a year of soul-crushing challenges: monotony, military discipline, degrading tasks, awareness that stateside friends and family were living life without them, the threat of violence, and an oppressive uncertainty about the future. Given the lack of control that they must have felt, is it any wonder that GIs sought to exercise a little dominion over their lives by making choices in how to spend their paychecks? This juice, that magazine, this camera, that stereo, choosing what to consume made Vietnam seem a little bit more like home. This photograph, which I got from APHIS, but which they would not let me use as the cover of my book, belies, belies certain facts about American consumerism in Vietnam. And I think it's because of what is under the planter's candy. The planter's candy was obviously it was airbrushed, right? Before photoshopping, you had airbrushing. So the planter, he's not holding that can. Somebody put that over the magazine to conceal the fact that that's a naked woman. At first glance, the cramped appearance of this PX would indicate that this is a small store, and it was. You would think, oh, the antithesis of luxury here. But make no mistake, even these small stores rang up incredible sales. And no matter how small or primitive, every PX in Vietnam was extremely profitable and was but a link in a vast retail chain. At the peak of the PX system, which was around 1969, the Vietnam Regional Exchange managed 310 retail stores and 180 snack bars carrying over 3,000 items. The system as a whole generated retail sales in excess of 1.9 billion unadjusted for inflation for fiscal years 68 through 72, making the Vietnam PX system one of the largest department store chains in the world. In 1967, 2 years before US troop strength would peak, VRE was importing 120 million pounds of consumer goods to meet soldiers' needs each month, including 260,000 cans of peanuts. The Nudie magazine, carefully hidden under that airbrushed can of peanuts, was one of millions sold in Vietnam, yielding $12 million in annual sales. The suitcases on the wall behind the soldier were also a common purchase, with VRE selling over 300,000 pieces of luggage a year. High-end consumer goods like jewelry, automobiles, and electronics were also big sellers, with sophisticated cameras and stereo systems becoming a standard souvenir of a Vietnam tour of duty. I'm going to return to this consumerism in a few minutes, but before we get there, let's consider some other facets of the soldier's daily life in Vietnam. So if we follow this soldier home to his hooch at the end of the day, his quarters could have been anything. Soldiers' quarters or living conditions in Vietnam existed on a spectrum, with grunts making the best of it wherever they could on one end of the spectrum. And then on the other end of the spectrum, you had rearward soldiers who spent a great deal of time and money customizing their living spaces. So these are some of those images. And then the one at the bottom that says my home, that was my dad's hooch in his second tour in Vietnam. So the widespread availability of electricity, especially after 1967, meant that soldiers could purchase devices like fans, radios, televisions, mini refrigerators, hot plates to improve their comfort. It was also common for them to scavenge plywood, parachute silk, and other materials to make durable and decorative improvements to their homes. There was a casual approach to fire safety in most barracks and to electrical wiring that was completely overcapacitated by soldiers' personal electronics. And I found one report from 1972 that found, quote, more fires start from electrical misuse than from any other known cause, more than enemy rocket attacks, more than Viet Cong sabotage, more than the war itself. If we follow our soldier to the mess hall, we find evidence there of the Army's massive food program. Fully 90% of the meals that the Army served in Vietnam were A rations served hot, including hot meals delivered by helicopter or truck to infantry units on patrol in the countryside. So some veterans may recognize the Mermite containers there. The Army's model menu was designed to provide each soldier with 4,500 calories a day, which would kill a person who's not 18 and working out constantly. The Army's model, this effort involved erecting a dozen field bakeries to provide fresh baked bread, with the largest of these bakeries cranking out 180,000 loaves a day, which made it the largest bakery in the world. Private US dairy companies Foremost and Meadow Gold built plants in South Vietnam that were capable of processing 1.4 million gallons of milk, 160,000 gallons of cottage cheese, and 2 million gallons of ice cream every month. The money, equipment, and expertise involved in providing fresh fruit, vegetables, and meats throughout a war zone where temperatures frequently topped 100 degrees was staggering. The Army moved so much perishable food throughout the war zone that the largest American-built structure in all of South Vietnam was a massive cold storage warehouse in Quy Nhon that was the size of 6 football fields. Many veterans have remarked in their memoirs that they found the food available to them in Vietnam among the best they ever had in the military. Depending on where our soldier was stationed, his leisure hours were likely filled with copious amounts of alcohol. The beer ration for Americans stationed in Vietnam allowed soldiers to purchase up to 5 cases per month, and they were expected to consume what they bought as they bought it to prevent black marketeering or hoarding for blowout parties, which did happen anyway. There was no limit on drinking in Vietnamese establishments, nor at open mess clubs, which mushroomed throughout the war. And the images on the left, there are 3 different open mess clubs, or the one at the top is a kind of primitive enlisted man's club, and then you have an NCO open mess. And I think the one at the bottom is the officers open mess at Ton Sa Nut. Let's see, where was I? Okay, by 1969, there were 2,000 open mess clubs sprinkled on American bases in South Vietnam. And some of them were incredibly elaborate in their decor, and they had slot machines and live entertainment every night. All of them were profitable. The open mess system generated staggering sales, gross sales of $177 million annually at the system's peak. And eventually officials clawed back enough cash from the slot machines and the open mess safes in South Vietnam to build a hotel at Fort de Russy in Honolulu. There were wholesome forms of recreation, of course, with the Army building over 1,300 athletic facilities in South Vietnam by 1971. Most of these were graded fields and multi-use courts for volleyball and basketball, but the Army's recreation program also included more elaborate facilities like bowling alleys, a few golf courses, and even a go-kart track. On-post craft shops, dark rooms, libraries, entertainment centers, including a couple with repertory theater companies, indoor and outdoor movie theaters, officially sanctioned steam baths and massage parlors on post, that, as you might expect, provided officially not sanctioned but totally tolerated sexual services. USO clubs, special services clubs, Red Cross clubs, and recreational beaches rounded out efforts to fill the leisure hours of an often disgruntled soldier workforce. Given the expense in building and maintaining them, swimming pools were the ultimate expression of American wealth and ingenuity in South Vietnam. It's impossible to know definitively how many pools there were, but special services maintained 48, and then there were unit pools. So there's just really no way to make a count. On Long Binh Post, which was the biggest, most elaborate base in South Vietnam, there were a dozen swimming pools. So you get a sense of the range here, that there's one on the bottom that was probably inherited from the French. The one on the top left is a complete improvised, plastic and cinder blocks. They're trying to make something there. And the one on the right is the pool at the MACV Annex in Saigon, which was 50 meters long, had 8 lanes and a graduated depth of 4 to 18 feet, 3 diving boards, a sun deck with patio furniture, restroom, showers, and a snack bar. Swimming pools represented American prosperity to soldiers far from home, but also a kind of technological mastery over the enemy and the elements. So hopefully by now, I've convinced you that these alternative settings for the war existed and that they were widespread. And there's a lot more deep discussion of all of this in Armed with Abundance. But there are some caveats. The landscape of this material abundance didn't develop overnight. Rather, it was years in the making, so that the end of the war was better stocked than the beginning. And the amenities didn't exist everywhere because the tactical situation didn't allow it. American bases in South Vietnam could go from a collection of tents in a rice paddy to a well-stocked, heavily fortified city in a matter of months. The bases that existed the longest were the most well-developed because local commanders had tremendous discretion over how to allocate resources and prioritize construction. So after the war, there was an internal Army study that examined this phenomenon, and they found that base commanders' distinction between necessity and nice to have got really fuzzy over time, such that construction projects that improve living conditions or facilitated recreation were almost always characterized as essential, no matter how elaborate. And I'm not talking here about making nicer barracks for the troops. One of the most outrageous projects that did eventually get canceled as a result of negative media scrutiny was creating a dammed recreational lake outside of Long Binh, like literally building a lake for boating and fishing. And it did get canceled, but that was an essential project in 1971. So now we're going to get back a little bit to consumerism. And there's a lot of images here, all from the Vietnam War, of the VRE system. This is the PX, I think that's the PX at MACV. And then the one where the guy is holding the Sony transistor radio, that's a portable mobile PX where they flew in, consumer goods in a shipping container to a remote fire base for guys to shop. So to combat declining morale and prevent unsavory activity, which I'm going to talk about, the US military created policies that refocused soldiers' energies around on-post consumption of food, drink, recreation, and especially consumer goods. The widespread availability of subsidized consumer goods, these were often things that guys couldn't have afforded if they were not serving in the Army or serving in the military in Vietnam. So these were subsidized consumer goods. They were only one part of the military's efforts. Vietnam's extensive PX system made all sorts of products available in country, throughout the country, via mobile PXs on trucks or in shipping containers that were delivered to fire bases by helicopter. The Pacific Exchange catalog made even more items available for use in Vietnam or to be sent home. I have the Mikimoto pearls that my dad bought for my grandmother in Vietnam, right? That was through the PASEX catalog. And military publications constantly emphasized shopping as a key part of the R&R experience. As a result, service in Vietnam could be transformative for an individual who saved and spent rationally. Official publications highlighting the consumption opportunities for servicemen offered an appealing narrative of a boy who goes off to Vietnam, wisely refuses to spend his money frivolously on beer and female companionship, but spends it lavishly on durable goods like watches, custom suits, electronics, or even a car. And then returns home from the war a big man. The US military engineered many policies to facilitate the acquisition and maintenance of consumer goods, including a free electronics repair program, insurance coverage for goods damaged incident to military service, liberal customs policies that enabled GIs to cart home their purchases duty-free, and cheap, secure shipping for purchases made in Vietnam. Taken together, the PX system and the myriad command policies about consumption affirmed that US troops in Vietnam were expected to carry home significantly more personal property than they arrived with at the start of their tours. The ability to shop while at war was the linchpin of morale-building initiatives on US bases, making consumption a strange yet essential part of the American Vietnam War experience. Not every soldier in Vietnam could access these opportunities to relax and consume because their roles precluded participation or kept them in the field. There were tremendous disparities, with a minority of personnel enduring austere conditions and violence, and a vast majority who lived in comparative safety and had access to amenities and consumer goods on a regular basis. Long Binh Post, home of US Army Vietnam headquarters, is the ultimate example. It was the largest American base in South Vietnam, home to 60,000 Americans, and so vast that it had its own commuter bus system. Long Binh was so remote from the shooting war that it even had its own museum to teach residents and visitors about the war in rural areas. It was called the Nature of the War Museum, and it was an outdoor parklet that featured a water buffalo pen. There was no water buffalo, just the pen, and life-size replicas of a Vietnamese villager's home, a temple, which is what is depicted here. This is a Vietnam veteran. This guy was on active duty, but he was in civilian clothes that day, and he graciously allowed me to publish that photo in the book. So yeah, it's like kind of a replica of a village. So there's a home, a temple, and then this big haystack that could conceal, like it had a little cutout in it where weapons could be hidden. And then all of these were connected by underground tunnels. So it's a pretty elaborate little display. So life at Long Binh or on other big US bases wasn't what many military personnel were expecting when they arrived in Vietnam. They wanted or thought that they wanted and steeled themselves for a coming-of-age, life-defining experience, but instead they found a stateside quality of life on many of these bases, and it became a running joke in publications by and for American GIs about so-called REMFs obscuring their actual war experiences in letters home, and that's what the cartoon depicts. So if you can, the scanned image is blurry, but in the original you can read what's in the clerk's typewriter, and basically he's writing to his girlfriend about his battlefield exploits, and he's lying to her that there are no women around. And so this was a kind of running joke that you see in GI newsletters and other publications. And then the image at the right on the bottom there, that's US Army Vietnam headquarters in South Vietnam. So what was all of this abundance for? The main reason is what I call the consumption for morale equation. Military authorities at all levels appreciated the tenuousness of soldier morale. At best, the American public was deeply ambivalent about the war in Vietnam, with polls consistently expressing regret for having gone in, and that was sentiment that many soldiers shared. Even soldiers who truly believed in the necessity of containing communism in South Vietnam eventually came to realize that many of the people they were there to save were indifferent to their efforts, or if not outright hostile. It's also important to remember that the military of the Vietnam era was not an all-volunteer force. US forces in Vietnam were composed of about 1/3 draftees, 1/3 draft-motivated volunteers, and 1/3 true volunteers. Even if soldiers found themselves working routinized rearward jobs on wholly modern Americanized bases, that is, even if they were completely insulated from the shooting war, they were still reluctant temporary participants in military culture. Under these circumstances, military authorities sought ways to ease the burden of military service in Vietnam. Providing comfort, entertainment, and easy access to consumer goods was an obvious way to maintain compliance among this disgruntled soldier workforce, especially in the rear, especially late in the war, because they often didn't have enough to do. If idle hands are the devil's playground, then Vietnam was the devil's Disney World. Imagine an enormous population of young men in the prime of their lives, hormones raging, alcohol flowing, many of them had access to weapons, they had disposable income, and they didn't want to be there. Participation in South Vietnam's sex trade was yet another form of American consumption, but also a key feature of an alternate universe created by the war. Americans could buy pretty much anything in Vietnam. Currency at staggeringly profitable rates, cheap drugs of incredible purity, war trophies like bloodied Viet Cong battle flags or Chinese-made rifles that you could use to authenticate your war experience. And of course, even Vietnamese bodies were for sale to shine American shoes, rub their backs, or satisfy them sexually. For a lot of Americans, Vietnam was what I call a war zone wonderland, a space separate from the world where appetites for sex, drugs, and violence could be indulged without sanction or critique. The military wanted wholesome outlets to channel soldiers' energy and capture their spending because the stakes were high. Fighting, gambling, black market activity, drug and alcohol abuse, sexual exploitation of Vietnamese women, the unsanctioned killing of Vietnamese civilians, all of these were corrosive to good order. They undermined civil-military relations with Vietnamese stakeholders, and they threatened the outcome of the war itself. So did it work? Did pouring resources into the war zone to replicate a stateside standard of living actually shore up American morale? No, it did not. As a morale booster, its core purpose, the abundance failed to maintain soldier morale. First of all, abundance begat a desire for more abundance. Comfort has an ever-expanding definition. The more insulated soldiers were from the war, the more accommodations they expected. And the following generalizations are based on actual complaints in Inspector General files. Soldiers who slept in beds wanted hooch maids to clean up after them. Soldiers who ate hot dinners each night wanted ice cream for dessert. Soldiers who worked in stuffy offices wanted fans or central air to keep them cool, and soldiers who worked 9-hour shifts wanted quality entertainment for the rest of the evening. As soldiers traversed the war zone and saw how others lived, the abundance also triggered envy between units on a base, between bases, and between branches of service. There was no point at which total group satisfaction was achieved because just like in civilian life, there was always some new amenity being enjoyed by some other unit somewhere else. A bowling alley, a pizza oven, Red Cross girls, or a bowling alley where Red Cross girls served pizza. There was always something. Their complaints are not as petty as they sound. The soldiers could see the staggering resources poured into base development and blowing up huge swaths of jungle. Why couldn't the Army keep the PX shelves stocked and provide better cuts of meat in the mess hall? Also, many support personnel were so well insulated from the shooting war that they could scarcely discern a reason for being in Vietnam in the first place. Recall that Nature of the War Museum, that some members of the American military on the ground in Vietnam are learning about the shooting war and life in the villages by reading about it or visiting a museum to learn about it. So absent a compelling reason for giving up their civilian lives, they figured they might as well be comfortable. Veterans' memoirs, and especially statements soldiers made at the time, indicate that ice cream and consumer goods were but poor substitutes for a cause they believed in, a fight that was likely to be won, and confidence in military and civilian leaders. The military carefully tracked morale through a series of indicators like absenteeism, acts of insubordination, criminal assaults, and formal complaints, and by every measure, troops stationed in the rear, those who had the most but risked the least, had lower morale than combat troops stationed in contested areas. In formal complaints, newsletter editorials, and letters home, soldiers stationed in the rear lamented that the conflict they had steeled themselves for did not materialize. Service in Vietnam was difficult, make no mistake, but long hours in an office, manual labor in the blazing sun, hot sleepless nights in a barracks, the loneliness, the feeling that life at home is going on without you, these were not the kinds of sacrifices that make young men feel like warriors. And just because this material abundance existed, that didn't mean that American soldiers actually appreciated it. In fact, many of them hated it. What they got was Mickey Mouse. What they wanted was John Wayne. Overall, soldiers in Vietnam tended to see their military service not as a bridge to economic or professional opportunity, let alone a necessity to keep the nation safe, but rather as a thing to be endured. The military's one-year rotational policy exacerbated this tendency, creating a culture of collective yet individualized longing. Soldiers worked not towards victory or even towards the end of the war, which increasingly felt like it could not be won. Instead, they fixated on their own individual tours of duty. On a million DROS calendars, they counted down the days until they could go home, leave the military, and resume their lives again. They didn't want a home front standard of living in Vietnam. They wanted to go home. So why does any of this matter? So I want to expand the frame a little bit here and think about some of the implications of all this abundance. So first of all, it is incredibly resource intensive. And the best way to demonstrate that is to talk about the Miss America show starring Phyllis George at the Screaming Eagle, at the Fubai Eagle Bowl, which was the 101st Airborne Division's amphitheater. And so I used this security plan for this one event to explain the resource intensiveness of this effort to shore up morale. So the crowd at this event, the crowd photo and this show are not the same. I couldn't find a photo of the crowd. But it was a crowd of 8,300 US servicemen who came out to see Miss America. And so the first order of business for the security plan was like to rally the MPs to create spot checks to prevent soldiers from bringing weapons or explosives into the venue. And then they had to address external-based security to protect the audience and the performers from enemy attack. So plan elements included aerial reconnaissance and ground patrols, aerial rocket artillery fire to suppress enemy activity in the area, 3 helicopters and a medic on standby to evacuate Miss America, a chase team of helicopters and combat units to pursue hostile forces. And these resources, which were the envy of the Viet Cong and the North Vietnamese, who had no air power, lacked transportation, and a steady supply of ammunition, only provided security during the show. Those resources didn't make the show. The show itself demanded an enormous plot of land that was sculpted into a base, seating for 8,000 people, a full-service stage with dressing rooms, sophisticated sound and lighting systems, transportation and housing for the performers, and reliable utilities to pull it all off. Miss America's performance at the Eagle Bowl was probably among the grandest of the USO shows in Vietnam, but the circuit, the entertainment circuit, was vast. The USO sponsored some 5,500 performances during the war, and the Army's Special Services sponsored thousands more. And all of this exacted a cost because soldiers and airmen risked their lives to keep audiences and entertainers safe. Second, beyond the expenditure of resources, we have to consider the way that this abundance operates within the political context of the war. American success or failure in the Vietnam War did not rest on the projection of power, something at which US forces excelled, but rather on the ability to win the hearts and minds of a majority of the South Vietnamese people. Presented in the context of Vietnamese poverty, American abundance is deeply unsettling. Presented in contrast to the insurgents' way of war, it was downright counterproductive. The United States did not create poverty in South Vietnam, but the war certainly exacerbated it. By relying on massive firepower to disrupt the activities of enemy forces, the US rendered much of South Vietnam's countryside too unsafe for civilians to remain in their homes working on their farms. Throughout the war, US and South Vietnamese forces forcibly relocated villagers, creating heartache but also economic hardship. In the span of a few years in the mid-1960s, South Vietnam went from being a primarily agricultural society to being a primarily urban one, and about 1/3 of South Vietnam's population experienced homelessness. In the same period, South Vietnam's economy transitioned from an agricultural economy to a service economy that was organized around catering to American servicemen. In desperation, South Vietnamese people congregated around American bases because US soldiers were the only people in Vietnam with disposable income. Lucky South Vietnamese people got legit jobs on American bases doing construction, cooking, stocking the shelves, cleaning up after American GIs. But there were not enough of these jobs to go around, contributing to a disturbing black market in which otherwise law-abiding people sold contraband, drugs, and their own bodies or the bodies of their sisters and brothers to US servicemen in order to support their families. The services Vietnamese people provided to Americans situated their poverty alongside unimaginable abundance, divided by a hard boundary that American officials policed with vigor. Vietnamese employees were forbidden from scavenging on their jobs. Just taking home a single hamburger bun was enough to get you fired. And they were subject to searches, including cavity searches. That was rarer, but it did happen upon leaving work. Outside the bases, the US had to put its garbage somewhere, and the largest landfill in the world was outside the US base at Da Nang. And Vietnamese people would scavenge, and that's what you see in the bottom image there. And to prevent that scavenging, which allowed Vietnamese people to make homes and feed their families out of American garbage, some base commanders ordered that the dumps be booby-trapped or burned. So dangling this material abundance before the South Vietnamese, but keeping it just out of reach, did not ingratiate Americans to the people they had come to save. And then by contrast, the National Liberation Front and the North Vietnamese made a virtue of necessity, framing the austerity of the revolution as evidence of its moral purity, especially when compared to how the Americans operated. So the asceticism of the average North Vietnamese or NLF recruit was both pronounced and politically charged. And I'm gonna, in the interest of time, kind of cut forward here, but the suffering and the sacrifice of North Vietnamese and NLF soldiers and insurgents was stunning. They had very little medical care. Their hospitals lacked electricity. There's one story in, I highly recommend Christian Appy's Patriots, and it's about a medical team in a Viet Cong field hospital riding a bicycle to generate electricity so that they could conduct surgery. There were women who maintained the Ho Chi Minh Trail at night, and they were so debilitated by years of manual labor in the dark that they returned home hairless and sterile from that work. The constant threat of American bombs, artillery, and soldiers took its toll. And yet Vietnamese insurgents and fighters, they were hunted, hungry, and homesick, but they did not want for belief. Their enduring morale was sustained not through material abundance, but through relentless propaganda that some of them had imbibed since infantry, and this forged since infancy, and this forged a strong sense of purpose that was strengthened through shared struggle. Vietnamese people who sacrificed for the revolution believed that they would win because they had righteousness on their side. Lastly, I want to close by thinking about how Vietnam service affected U.S. servicemen, even amidst the abundance that pervaded their tours of duty. I've learned a lot and done a lot of thinking since I wrote Armed with Abundance, and also had a lot of conversation with Vietnam veterans as a result of the book. The sourcing for the book is both broad and deep, and the material abundance that surfaces cannot be denied. I stand by my arguments that danger and deprivation were distributed unevenly in the war zone, that American material abundance was everywhere in South Vietnam, that U.S. military authorities sustained American troop morale by pushing consumer goods, entertainments, and leisure activities at American military personnel, that U.S. prosecution of the war was often counterproductive, and especially that how the average person, let alone Hollywood, imagines the Vietnam War's physical environment, the work of the war, and the daily life of the American soldiery is deeply, deeply flawed. That said, I've also come to realize that material abundance and routinized work days did not insulate American soldiers from hardship and trauma. And I don't mean physical wounds. I mean emotional upheaval, powerful enough to leave a mark that endured for the rest of their lives. The souvenirs and labor-saving devices, the swimming pools and beaches, R&R, television, go-kart tracks and bowling alleys, open mess clubs, floor shows, and go-go dancers, and so much beer. That was all real. But all of those things were powerless to assuage soldiers' loneliness, their anger at those who did not have to serve in Vietnam, and their frustration that home front life was going on without them. And then there was the fear. Usually not a screaming fear like one might have during a mortar attack, but the low-key corrosive fear of, say, living in a really bad neighborhood where people die from violence a few blocks over. Here's an example of what I'm talking about. Several years ago, I was in a copy shop working with some images of recreational facilities in Vietnam, and a random man pointed to a photo and said, "I know that building." And I was skeptical because it was a photo of an officers' club at Long Binh Post. But in fact, he walked past it every day as a young draftee in 1969. His Vietnam service took place entirely on Long Binh, the most populous base in South Vietnam, among the most elaborate and probably the most secure. His work involved pushing paper at USRV headquarters and was as far removed from conventional ideas about war as can be. But he told me something that stays with me. Every day he served in Vietnam, he thought he was going to die. What I came to realize from that comment is that believing one has been exposed to danger is the same thing as being exposed to danger. And believing that the war changed you is the same as the war changing you. Armed with Abundance is absolutely a critique of US conduct of the Vietnam War and of the narrow frame through which the American public remembers it. But it is not a critique of American soldiers who ate ice cream or bought TVs or went to the beach once or even every day during their Vietnam service. I'm glad for what they had because going to war is hard, though some of it is harder. Being away from home is lonely and scary. Serving in a war zone, even in an office, is unsettling. And most of those guys, they were just kids. For a lot of them, Vietnam was the biggest thing that ever happened to them, and no fancy watch or stereo system could compensate for the disjuncture it created in their lives. So Armed with Abundance is one of the few places where that side of the war is acknowledged and discussed. I think we would do well to create more space for veterans of this other kind of war to tell their stories without judgment that nobody ever shot at them. Thank you. Yes, sir.
You left out one of the, I think, most important parts of abundance was the fact that we sling-loaded beer into fire bases. This was before the issue of General Order Number 1 in Desert Storm, but this was done every day.
Yeah.
As far as that goes, which is great. And I would venture to say that if we looked at the sales at the PX, the greater majority was probably through catalog sales because the catalog was available to every soldier.
Mm-hmm.
And it was not just sending, getting stereos, but, many of them were just married. They were sending dishes to
Right.
their wives.
Right.
And so that went on too. And I don't, I never saw a PX, but I saw the catalog.
Yeah.
So, but it was, you're right. It was quite an accomplishment to establish this supply line.
Yeah, absolutely. And speaking to the alcohol, there's a great book by Jeremy Kuzmarov called The Myth of the Addicted Army. And he says it's a myth. And I think that that is true. Excuse me, in terms of drug addiction in the Vietnam War, that rates of drug addiction were probably not any higher among the American soldiery than they were among civilians at the same time. But what doesn't get talked about is alcoholism, because at the time, people didn't understand alcoholism in the same way that they might understand it today. And in particular, the culture of the 1960s was that if you drank beer, you couldn't have an alcohol problem. And so, but there were comments that I've seen in memoirs and some official documentation that there were people saying, we've got a problem of alcoholism on American bases, where basically we've got a lot of people who are drunk all the time in their off-duty hours. But that was such a hot issue that the military really couldn't even touch it. And so the effort was through the ration system to try to slow down the pace of what soldiers could buy and the pace at which they consumed it. Have
you considered doing another study and compare that to our recent experiences in the Middle East? I think it would be really interesting to see if our changing regulations, philosophies, and everything have made a difference in what that impact was.
So it's funny you should say that. The last chapter, there's an epilogue to Armed with Abundance that talks about Iraq. And in terms of the feedback that I've gotten from the book, the most positive feedback that I get is from veterans of the Iraq War who read it and say, you nailed it. Because all of this existed in Iraq as well, less so in Afghanistan, but just that kind of inequality of experience was really potent, and American bases became like these glittering islands of relative safety and certainly a lot of excess that created disparities in the American experience, but then also for Iraqi people who had had their electricity and the infrastructure completely destroyed and then not efficiently rebuilt. It was really alienating and frustrating that these kind of American cities got dropped into the war zone, a kind of glittering abundance that they could see from a distance, but had no ability to access. So yeah, I did try to address that. The book came out in late 2011, and so the war was kind of officially over by that point, and I was able to make some broad comparisons. Yeah. Thank you. For For draft or draft motivated? So I'm taking, Christian Appy wrote a book called, what is that book called? It's from Christian Appy, so I'm gonna punt. That's where the citation is. And I cannot think of what that book is called, but he's the one that divides it. But it's very hard. So just to clarify, the difference between being drafted and draft motivated, or being a volunteer and a draft motivated volunteer, is that volunteers are people who want to be in the military and maybe even want to go to Vietnam, right? And so about a third of the people, by Christian Appy's estimate, who ended up serving in Vietnam were true volunteers. Draft motivated volunteers are people who get their draft notice, who know that, and this would be, 68, 69, when the draft calls are really high and the war in terms of casualties is really bad. People get this draft notice and they know that they're going to have to go. And so they want to mitigate their risk. If they allow the draft to scoop them up, it's very likely that they're going to end up in the Army. And then, unless they have special skills, they're going to end up in the infantry. So the way to mitigate your risk was to try to join the Air Force, right? Or try to join the Navy. Or if you did join the Army, try to negotiate with a recruiter to not end up in the infantry. And so those are people who joined technically voluntarily, but they joined because they were about to be drafted. And so when we think about how they felt about being in Vietnam, they didn't want to be there. And when you think about the trying to provide motivation and also control of the behavior of the American soldiery, by like 68 to 70, in that period when it's a really huge occupation force, a majority of these guys, they don't want to be there. And then President Nixon is sending all these signals through the withdrawal that the war is ending, right? So who wants to be the last person to die in a war? And people feel like they were abandoned there in that period of time. So the morale actually gets worse as the war starts to contract, the footprint of the war starts to contract for the American public.
When you teach the Vietnam War, do you teach I-Corps or the other part of the war, or just this?
Well, so when I teach the Vietnam War to undergraduates, it's a survey. So I-Corps is where the Marines were stationed. And I do in the book, yes, but the Marines were largely in control of I-Corps. And so what I want to say is that, like I said at the front, the bulk of the research is based on Army sources, but the Army's footprint and first logs, the first logistical division's kind of support of all of the service branches meant a really rich, deep body of source material. In the introduction to the book, I talk about some of the distinctions between branches of the service, and I-Corps was the least well-developed area of Vietnam, and then the situation for the Marines was quite different than it was for other military personnel. So it's hard to talk about, especially in a talk of this length, but that experience of abundance is really, just like your experiences in the war as a whole, is predicated on which branch of service, what your job is, where you're stationed, what year you're there. Yeah, over there.
Hi, Dr. Lair.
Hi.
You made us read Working Class War.
Oh, so Tom is one of my graduate students, and he can tell you how I teach the war, right? And to your question in terms of what I teach the whole thing, right, Tom?
Correct.
And there's a heavy emphasis on Vietnamese perspectives because I worked with William Diker, who's a leading Vietnamese scholar as a graduate student. So Tom, go ahead.
You were trying to come up with the name of the book, the Appy book. Was it Working Class War?
Yes, thank you. Working Class War, yeah. Is that it? You don't have a question, Tom? Okay. Hi, yes, sir.
When I got to Vietnam, it was Cam Ranh Bay, and I was put on a plane to go C-130 to go to Pleiku, drop some soldiers off, and then go to Bien Hoa to join my unit, the 199th.
So you got to see the whole, like, there's a big contrast between.
Now, this is December, the week before Christmas in December. It's nice during the day, but it's freezing at night, about 42 degrees. I'm in my khakis. We get to Pleiku and get kicked off the plane for a good reason. They used it as a medevac. Then I got to find out about consumerism. We stayed there from about 10 in the morning till midnight. And the only reason we got to Bien Hoa that night was the Air Force sent up a C-130 to the Pleiku Air Base to pick up the band who will be playing the next night at Bien Hoa. So the band gets on the C-130 with all their instruments, and then their pigs, and then their chickens, and their geese, and then 5 soldiers who've been sitting there all day long, and now it's midnight and in the highlands, and we're still in our khakis, freezing our you-know-whats off, get to fly to Benoit. So that was consumerism. The Air Force took care of us, but it took a while.
Yeah, that's an amazing set of contrasts between those 3 places. Benoit was huge and very well developed. I don't know what year you're talking about, but it was, you know, the aerial photographs, like it looks like a stateside base. It was so massive. And Cam Ranh, obviously the site of, recreation facilities there. And then Pleiku up in the Central Highlands, much more ascetic and remote, but there were still PXs up there, and there were still, you know, efforts to push entertainment and leisure up there. So it creates these weird experiences like the one that you had. I think in the end, like, it's all just really weird, right? That we sort of have an idea of what we think a war is, and sometimes the Vietnam War is in accordance with that, and then in other times it's just completely surreal, these contrasts. Yeah.
I really like your presentation, and what you talked about is things that I saw. I know when the Americans came into the Australian area, they went nuts because they were living in the same level that the Vietnamese were living. But my question to you is, how do we do it differently and how do we do it better? So when you made the comment about Iraq, we're making the same mistakes. We pulled out our 45 and shooting the same toes off. How do we deal with young men and now young women in a situation that's, you know, very, very much of an aberration, to use your terminology, and so that we don't keep making the same mistakes?
I don't have a satisfying answer to that question. I was like, someone is going to ask me what my prescription is. And this is kind of the luxury of the historian, that if we're operating within the ethics of our profession, we just get to punt on policy questions or questions of the future. I think in Iraq, one of the big differences was, one, there were women in the military. And so that changes the calculus. People weren't supposed to be having sex on American bases, but the fact that there were a lot of pregnancy tests and other and birth control for sale in American PXs says that it was happening. And so that helped to alleviate the civil military relations problem of prostitution. And then Americans were really confined in Iraq to American bases because they couldn't really be safe out in a village or a town. So that's something that's quite different, and that's just about actual security. In terms of doing it better or not making the same mistakes, I mean, I think all of this is kind of connected to the very flawed policy of nation building. And I think I certainly would not want to send Americans to war where they didn't have enough electricity and they didn't have comfort items and they weren't well fed, right? Like, no one wants that. And so then the question is like, well, when do we decide to send them to war, right? And so that's the corrective, is not to put them in impossible, wars that are unlikely to have a satisfying outcome.
I'd just like to add that I was in Long Binh, 1969 and 70. Everything you described is accurate. There was rampant consumerism. But I don't want, and I know you're not trying to make this impression, that there were a lot of folks in Vietnam never smelled danger. They stayed in their offices and that's all they did 24/7. Even in Long Binh, I was in a truck unit. There were huge logistical complex where units went out every day, facing danger, ambush, and the rest of it. Yeah, we came back at night usually. And the other thing is, even those sitting in offices were subject to mortar and rocket attacks. Any base in Vietnam would get rocketed or mortared. So it wasn't as cut and dry as that. I mean, some had it better than others, but we were all in danger, one sort or another, at different times.
Yeah, I think it is about degrees of danger. And I guess like what I hope from what people get from the book is just that they'll allow a greater range of experiences to permeate their consciousness when they think about the Vietnam War, because I'm not talking about you guys in this room. I think that you're a very self-selected group of people. The average American really conflates the Vietnam War with Platoon or you know, those kinds of movies. And or maybe more recently, We Were Soldiers, and that excises a majority of American participants because that experience was not common relative to the experiences that all Americans had in Vietnam.
Thank you.
All right, thank you so much. Those are great questions.
Okay, folks, we are going to take a 15-minute break. I want to thank Dr. Lair for her preparation and presentation. And we're glad to have her with us for today. Glad that she was part of our program.